Good morning. Welcome, or maybe it's afternoon, whenever you're watching this video. Welcome to our Bible study. I'm Pastor Jack Price. This is a continuing study of the Gospel of Matthew. We do a variety of studies here, but the Gospel of Matthew, we are now in part 19, our 19th in the series, and we're not done yet. So I hope that you're enjoying this. We are in book 5 of Matthew. Now, this is not going to be labeled in your Bible, but Matthew is based on 5 core books or sections, each with a narrative section of activities that Jesus did and also teachings, and then a longer teaching discourse. And so book 5, we're kind of moving along in the story. Jesus has gone to Jerusalem to confront the religious leaders in the temple there. And we're in chapter 22 of Matthew's Gospel, and verses 1 through 10 is a parable that Jesus spoke. Beginning in verse 1, once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, burned their city. And then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets, gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, till the wedding hall was filled with guests." So, wedding feast was a fairly typical setting in the Gospels, which Jesus often used to illustrate this idea of God's kingdom, which is not the way we often think about heaven or the end of this life, the beginning of the next one, in terms of a big festival party. But wedding feast, lots of great food, good wine, and celebration. Now this story, or something very similar, is in Luke's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 16 to 24, but there are some differences. In Matthew's Gospel, the host is a king. In Luke, it's just a certain man. The party becomes, in Matthew, a banquet, a wedding banquet for his son, a marriage feast. But the invited guests all decline the invitations because they are absorbed with their projects at home or in business. In essence, the everyday affairs of life took precedence over the call of Christ. Because this is a parable. It's not meant to be a historic story. It's meant to be a teaching. And the core teaching is that, these invited guests just let other things take precedence, everyday things. God's invitation is to great joy, and yet we miss it because of the focus on everyday tasks. They just absorb us. The root of their lives, of these people who were invited, was not God. It was home and business. So when faith keeps taking a backseat to real world issues, then truly first things are put second. And most of the time, this arrangement works for us. But in special times of life, times of birth, times of death, times of crisis, times of deep celebration, we lightly touch the deep mystery of life. And we wonder, why is it so unfamiliar to us? It's because we don't pay attention to it. We don't give the deep mystery of life first priority in our lives. Going on in chapter 22, beginning in verse 11, going through verse 14. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" And he was speechless, the man. And then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." So this story, obviously, we see it connected with the first story, but it appears to be a separate story that has been grafted on to that first story of the wedding banquet. The gift of God, the gift of heaven, is freely granted grace, but God's grace cannot be abused. The man's lack of a wedding garment, it's like he did not wear his tuxedo to a formal banquet. It demonstrates his lack of appreciation for what a big deal this was, how important this really was. And in response to the host's question, how did you get in here? The man had no response. He didn't even try, didn't try to explain, didn't even make up a lame excuse. He just was quiet. He was the example for us in that in life we are sometimes confronted by a truth that's difficult, and that it's time to make our response for or against that truth. And this man refused to commit by saying nothing. How many Christians today choose to keep quiet in the face of the challenges in our world, the challenges to our church, the challenges to our faith? It may be asked, how did we get in here without the proper attitude? Going on, verse 15 through 21 of Matthew's 22nd chapter. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test? You are hypocrites. Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And then he said to them, "Whose head is this? Whose title, whose image on the coin?" And they answered, "The emperor's." And then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." And when they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. So the religious leaders are trying another angle of attack on Jesus by sending their proxies, their disciples and the Herodians, trying to entrap him into saying something against paying taxes to the Romans. Popular opinion, of course, opposed paying the tax. But for Jesus to say that would have brought swift and pretty brutal Roman reprisal. The trap seemed foolproof, but Jesus seemed to side with the paying the tax as a sign of loyalty to the ruling authorities. At least that's the direction it seemed to go. Did he really mean to divide the world into Roman and Jewish, secular and sacred? The key question is, what is Caesar's, the emperor's, and what is God's? Of course, religious leaders had capitulated to the Romans for a long time. They had partnered with them in many ways, already giving to Caesar. And this giving was hurting people. It was depriving the masses of their land, their opportunity to make a decent living. Jesus knew this, and the people knew this as well. Jesus' focus was that everything is God's, even what we give in taxes. Even the emperor belongs to God. The religious leaders revealed how they traded in a world of commerce and how little with the temple's work. The coin had a graven image and represented a kind of idolatry. The graven image was the picture of the emperor. It's not the coin that was used in the temple. You had to change that for a fee for the temple currency, but it was the temple of the coinage of commerce. Jesus' words about giving to Caesar were a pointed challenge to how the religious leaders failed to give God what belonged to God. Now going on, chapter 22, verse 23 through 33. The same day, some Sadducees came to him saying, "There's no resurrection." And that's what they believed. And they asked him a question saying, "Teacher, Moses said if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. The second did the same, so also the third, down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, then, whose wife will she be? For all of them had married her." Jesus answered them, "You are wrong. because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for you, as for the resurrection of the dead, you've not read what it was said to you by God. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is God not of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astounded at his teaching. So, the Sadducees were a powerful foe to Jesus, maybe the most powerful of the religious leader group. And the Sadducees generally were pretty rigid about the law, very conservative, and they generally did not believe in a resurrection of the dead. They thought when you died, that was it. Jesus' authority came from knowing more than they did, knowing about the nature of life and life after this life, and what Scripture says about it, that resurrection life is not a poor copy of earthly life, but it's a completely new kind of existence. What Jesus means by no marriage in heaven, well, there are some views on that. One possibility is life in heaven is not a continuing of the inequities of this life, but it's a brand new quality of life. A second is that Jesus' view does not denigrate life here, or does not denigrate its institutions like marriage. He does not say that love that binds us here won't continue. Love will be greater, he says. Commitment more powerful, more pure, more intimate there than here. And the third possibility is that God makes eternity far better than life on earth. Human love reaches its full potential, far more than it does here, yet absolutely connected to the love that we experience here. C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian author, talks about love in heaven as being the real thing, that what we experience now in this earth, in this life, is just a shadow of that real love. When we come to know God more the way Jesus did, we will begin to taste, to touch, to feel God's ways even now, really a foretaste of glory divine. I think this is one of the issues that for many Christians is a continuing problem, is that we always try to interpret the things of God in light of what we know here on earth. We try to understand heaven in terms of our experience of earth and what Jesus is telling us. And I think if we use our minds of faith, we'd recognize that what we experience on earth is a reflection, even a dim reflection of heaven, and not the other way around. Okay? All right. The last portion of this chapter, Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 to 40, and then another section, 41 to 46. Beginning in verse 35, now, when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, one of them a lawyer, and asked a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Well, we're so familiar with that passage, it's kind of amazing to think how it must have sounded when it was originally spoken. Jesus knew that the religious leaders held about 613 commandments, ways to unpack all the laws, divided into 613 commandments, and I'm sure there were many sub-commandments and directives on how to interpret all of these commandments. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus, well, which of these 613 commandments is the greatest? And Jesus just said, the first and great commandment is to love God. Love God with our free will, to love God as fully as we can, all of our passion. Faith in God cannot be compelled by rules. It can only be chosen through passionate commitment. We must give of ourselves in order to enjoy the relationship that we want with God. And God offers us freely, but we have to return the love for it to work. It doesn't just happen, it's freely given to us, but unless we embrace it, unless we accept it, unless we love in return, we'll never experience that power. And then the second commandment is just as important, that we must love our neighbor as ourselves. God love, God comes first, but neighbor love is just as important, equally important. I can't say that too much. It's really inseparable from God love. God love, neighbor love is all of one piece. And so our social obligation is part of our love for God. And this is what's so important in living lives as followers of Jesus. Social justice is the sacrament, the tangible expression of divine love. And then Matthew 22, verses 41 to 46. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question: "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" And they said to him, "The son of David." And he said to them, "How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one was able to give him an answer. Nor from that day did anyone dare ask him any more questions. So, Jewish hope was for the Messiah who would be a son of David, a descendant of King David. Christians began to recognize Jesus as much more than that, much more than coming to set up the Jewish kingdom, God's kingdom, in a physical manifestation. By having David worship the Messiah, how can the Messiah be David's son? And this was Matthew's way of enlarging the concept of who Jesus was, Lord more than Son of David. And this, as we move closer and closer to that time of Jesus' arrest and passion and crucifixion and finally resurrection, we come to recognize how his followers began to expand their understanding of who he was, what he was talking about. Okay, and we'll do more of that next week. God bless you and take care.